And we also have online Simona Ziporski, who is a co-lead of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative working group. So we will start by giving the floor to Dr. Kate O'Brien, who will give us a little bit overview of the situation when it comes to immunization and the SAGE. And after that, Dr. Alejandro Cravioto will present conclusions from a meeting that took place again from 5th to 7th October. That was this week. Dr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Tarek. So I'd just like a few opening comments, just a reminder to those who are familiar and an introduction to those who are not about SAGE. SAGE is, as Tarek explained, the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization. It's a group of 15 individuals from around the world who are experts in both specific vaccines, epidemiology, public health, and the systems that are used to deliver vaccines. And they work throughout the year in two meetings to prepare evidence and recommendations around critical immunization and vaccine policy questions. And this past meeting had a large number of substantive topics on the agenda. Of course, this is all within the context that we're all living through now of the COVID-19 pandemic, layered on a situation where within the global immunization framework and work that's done in every country, there are just about 14 million children in the past year who received no vaccines whatsoever through the routine immunization program. These are referred to as zero-dose children in our technical language. And so it is in this setting where we're working hard and observing, measuring carefully what the impact of COVID-19 is on an immunization program that has been struggling to reach, especially those people in the communities who have not been reached and has been stuck for about 10 years. We will, Dr. Cravioto will comment on the review that was done of the situation of response to the COVID-19 pandemic and how to recover the immunization programs. What we did here at the meeting was reports from every region about the backsliding of immunization programs, in some cases, severe backsliding. In particular, we had recommended early in the pandemic to pause on vaccination campaigns to give the programs time to adapt to COVID-19 and assess the safety measures that would be needed to conduct large immunization campaigns safely for both healthcare workers and for the families who are attending those campaigns. We heard from all regions that those campaigns are now recovering, some more quickly than others, and that there are strong examples of country programs that are starting to recover their immunization activities, especially those activities that take place at fixed posts or fixed clinics. So those are the sort of primary opening comments that I wanted to make on the context within which the SAGE meeting took place, and of course with a real spotlight on we hope what is around the corner are COVID-19 vaccines. So I'll turn it over now to you, Alejandro, to provide an update on what actually came out of the meeting with respect to specific recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Good afternoon or good evening to everybody. I think that after our meeting in April, which was really the beginning of the storm that we have been facing, we were able to start a very active working group within SAGE that has been dealing with the issues related with the way that we see not only the COVID problem, but also the way that vaccines against this virus are going to help us in some ways. Therefore, the session on the COVID-19 vaccine started really with a review of the epidemiology, the vaccine landscape, the modeling efforts to see how we develop vaccination policies, and a report from the Global Advisory Committee on Vaccine Safety about what has been shown so far with the vaccines in development. In September of this year, SAGE was able to present to the Director General of the World Health Organization a document that was really a values framework on how we saw a number of ethical principles that would allow us to have a fair and balanced allocation of the vaccines as they became available. These values included human rights values, respect, equity at a global and national level, and of course the ideas of reciprocity and legitimacy. Building on that, the working group has now produced and SAGE has endorsed a second document, which is really how do we prioritize the vaccines as they come along in the sense of who should receive them first and why. This document is based on the ethical principles that we already saw, and it has the purpose of reducing the number of deaths by targeting specific populations who are either at high risk because of their activities or their profession, or because they are the most susceptible to be killed by the virus. In that sense, the document that has been reviewed at the meeting, adopted by SAGE, and fortunately this morning fully endorsed by the Director General of the World Health Organization, is a roadmap that can be used for discussions at a regional and a national level through the RITEX or the NITEX, as we call them, the National Advisory Technical Groups, that will allow them, each country, to define if they have access to these vaccines through the different financial mechanisms that have been put in place, how they should use the vaccine to be more effective. For that purpose, there are tiers about how much vaccine will be available for each country. And also at the same time, a modeling group is trying, with the data that is available, to see what would happen when this vaccine is allocated in the way that it's being proposed. I think that the document is a well-defined tool. This document will become available, will be translated to the languages that the World Health Organization uses so that it can be used in-house in the different countries. And especially, it needs to make two things clear. One, we require a whole gender perspective on how the vaccine will be used, in the sense not only of which gender has more problem, but which gender should receive the vaccine in a totally balanced way. And the second thing is, how do we actually prepare ourselves for what's coming next? How do countries actually start, on one side, looking at the safety of these vaccines in a more forceful way through good pharmacovigilance? And the other is, how do we make sure that all the clinical trials follow the good clinical practices that we have all approved? And how do the data safety monitoring boards for each one of these phase 3 trials really assess both the medical confidentiality of the participants and the way that the public is informed of the issues related to the safety of these vaccines? I would leave it there, and I would ask Kate and Joachim if they have anything more to add about this COVID.
Not on that one. Do we want to go through each of the, and then we can open it up to questions, so maybe move on to the...
So the other two things that we saw, as Kate well said, is what is the impact on the immunization schedules around the world, and how many children have been left without vaccines because of the COVID situation. And in that sense, we have two areas which we feel are extremely important. One, as Kate said, how do we restart our programs, making sure that the people who give out the vaccines are safe, and how do we bring people either separately or together to be able to vaccinate the children. And on the other hand, two things that are an issue of emergency. One is the way that we use a new oral vaccine against the second of the polio viruses, which has been the problem in these outbreaks that we've been seeing in different parts of the world, and that require a new product that has been under development and production to be used as soon as it is available. This is a vaccine that will be used under emergency situation authorization, that will be used for the control of these outbreaks that have been happening due to poliovirus type 2, and that we hope will be able to help us curb the problem. In the sense of the way that this vaccine will be used, there will be a sequence of ways of detecting what is the response to the vaccine, the safety of the vaccine, and that will inform us later on how this vaccine should be used outside of this emergency utilization process. The second thing that we looked into the polio area is the need to have a second dose of injected polio vaccine that would help us really to start curbing the problems of these outbreaks and to give the children a better perspective. This is independent of the doses of oral polio vaccine that a child receives, and we have made a recommendation to use the second injected dose of poliovirus when the children are about 6 weeks of age. The idea then is to make sure that we have these new vaccines, or these vaccines that are in practice used in a different way. What we don't recommend the use of the injected polio vaccine is to tackle the outbreaks that we've been having for these poliovirus derived from vaccine viruses too, which in a sense is something that has to be tackled with the oral vaccine that we have been developing that I talked about first. In the case of measles, we have gone back not only within SAGE, but with a larger group to be able to have a better strategic framework on how to tackle the problem of the elimination of measles. This new framework really puts in place a whole different plan and roadmap for this purpose. SAGE endorsed the framework, and we will now be working towards how this can be implemented to allow us to have a much better control of something that has been going out of hand, and that unfortunately is one of the issues that we're worried about with the drop in the vaccination rates in many parts of the world, which of course include the vaccination against measles. On the other hand, we have a new way of looking at the prospects for the next 10 years in this IA 2030 proposal that we have been reviewing for some time. We have a new way of monitoring and evaluating how this process will be done, and a new way to look at the oversight and accountability of the program, which is very important. What has to be considered within the immunization agenda 2030 or the IA 2030 is now the whole problem with the COVID existence. This has to be taken into account of how this is going to be part not only of the problem, but also of the solution that we have ahead. And we feel that regardless of the presence of vaccines, we're going to have to be dealing with this problem for a couple of years at the least, that will need to be considered as part of the strategy that we have been formulating. Finally, the other two things that we saw is how do we recommend the use of vaccines that could help reduce the comorbidities with COVID-19 in the elderly, mainly of vaccinating them against influenza, vaccinating them with a dose of pneumococcal vaccine, and of course, making them more liable to be found and vaccinated against the COVID vaccines when they become available. I would stop there and think that that would give you a basic idea of what the meeting was able to achieve.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carriata. Thank you very much, Dr. Brand. We will soon start with questions. Just to remind you that you need to click on raise hand for us to be able to get you online to ask you a question. I would just remind that we also have online Simona Ziporski, who is a co-lead of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. working group, and she will answer particularly any questions that may come regarding polio vaccines. We also have with us Dr. Joachim Hombach, that you can see, and he's Executive Secretary of SAGE, and he will also be able to answer questions. Just one precision, and maybe Joachim can help with that. I understand that the document with the conclusions of this meeting will be posted sometimes next week, because this is the questions that we were getting.
Yeah, this is correct. So we will post next week the meeting highlights, which provide you really with a summary on the outcomes of all the sessions that we had. The formal report will come out a bit later, which we publish in the weekly epidemiological record, and the publication date is December 4.
Okay, thank you very much for that precision, and we will make sure that the journalists get both the summary of the meeting and the full report once it is available. But this press conference is not under embargo, so journalists can report on it immediately. So we will start with questions now. First, we go to our Geneva-based colleague Gunilla von Hall, who writes for Swedish daily Svenska Dagbladet. Gunilla, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thanks for taking my question. I have a question on the development of the COVID vaccine. In many of the cases, especially AstraZeneca and Oxford, they have what is called a rolling review. This could mean the vaccine can be approved for use before the phase 3 is finalized, the results are published. My question is, how ethical do you think this is, and how do you think this will be met by the general public? Basically, how can they trust the safety? Thanks.
Thanks, Gunilla, for that question. I'd like to clarify what a rolling review means from a regulatory perspective, and what will be required from the clinical trials in order to have some sort of authorization. It's not quite as you described, so I really want to be sure that we have a correct record on this. A rolling review for authorization simply means that information about the product, the manufacturing, the clinical trials themselves is provided to regulatory authorities on a rolling basis, as opposed to delivering all that information in one full tranche after all the clinical trials are done. A rolling review results in speed, because while the clinical trials are ongoing, some of the data from the preceding elements of development can be reviewed in parallel while the clinical trial is ongoing. It does not mean that there will be an authorization before there are results from a phase 3 clinical trial. I think if we look at the stipulations by the regulatory authorities, all regulatory authorities to date that are stringent regulatory authorities and WHO are requiring that the results of phase 3 clinical trials are the basis for an early use listing or an emergency use listing. That doesn't mean that the trial necessarily has to be completed as designed, because each of the trials has interim looks at the data that are stipulated in the protocols that can allow an evaluation of the data once the data meet certain a priori established numbers of cases that would allow some kind of conclusion to be drawn depending on the actual efficacy of the vaccine. So I just want to clarify that a rolling review does not mean that the phase 3 trials are not going to be completed, nor that they would have data from the phase 3 clinical trials. That's not correct.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brand, for clarifying this. I think it's very important. Next question comes from our also Geneva-based colleague, John Zarakostas, who writes for Lancet. John, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me, Tariq? Hello?
Yes, John. Yes, John,
yes. Good afternoon. I've just got a bit of a technical question. if the SAGE experts could give me a bit of a readout, what sort of OPV is being used these days in developing countries? Is it the inactive variety or the active poliovirus variety? And also, what's your assessment on reports by doctors that they have linked some of the non-polio acute placid paralysis to some of the OPV?
Thank you, John. So I think for this question, we will call on Simona. Simona, I think you are able to unmute yourself, and if you can please address this question.
Yes, hi, John. Thank you very much for the question. With regards to the polio vaccines that are being used today in the routine immunization program, we're using a bivalent oral polio vaccine, which includes protection against type 1 and type 3 of the polio virus. But all countries have also introduced the inactivated polio vaccine, which is an injectable vaccine. And countries are giving at minimum 1 dose of that vaccine, which does provide protection against type 1, type 2, and type 3 polio. So there is some protection against all types of polio there. SAGE has just made a recommendation about adding a 2nd dose of IPV, and that will significantly boost the protection against type 2 polio vaccine. We do still have some outbreaks of type 2 that are occurring that are vaccine-derived cases. And in those instances, we are currently using monovalent oral polio vaccine type 2 that's controlled out of a global stockpile, so released at the discretion of the WHO Director General. That vaccine is not used. There's no other oral polio vaccine that contains type 2 that's used in the routine program. I have to confess that I'm personally not aware of these reports that link non-polio AFPs to OPV. I would welcome comments from other colleagues from SAGE who may be aware of those. Certainly, we do have rare instances where there are linkages between OPV use and the development of circulating vaccine-derived polio viruses. That's a rare event, but it does occasionally occur. And it's something we're hoping to reduce the incidence of with the introduction of the new novel oral polio vaccine that is more genetically stable and less likely to revert to a form that can seed these types of additional cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona, for this answer, and I hope John got what he needed. We will now go to Reuters. We have Emma Farge online. Emma?
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks for taking my question. I had a question about COVID priority populations and the document, please. Can you give a readout of what this document, which you say will be a roadmap for countries, says about who should receive the COVID-19 vaccines and why? And will this automatically apply then for all of the countries in COVAX? Thank you.
So perhaps let me address some of the first part of that, and I'll hand over to Alejandro for a second part. I want to be clear about what SAGE's recommendations mean. These are global recommendations, but it really is the responsibility of each country to set their own national policy. Having a global policy is a very strong steer for countries to leverage and to bounce off of the global recommendation. And most countries, many countries around the world rely on the SAGE recommendations as the basis for their in-country adaptation. But there is no authority or authority to implement, to impose the SAGE recommendations on any country. Every country has their own autonomy to implement their national program. What the prioritization, the population prioritization describes and lays out in this new document is recommendations on stages of targeting of populations according to 3 epidemiologic scenarios. The first epidemiologic scenario is for countries that have widespread community transmission of COVID. The second are countries that maybe have just an outbreak or very sporadic cases. And the third scenario is for countries that have no COVID, who have been able to control it and yet are concerned about importation of cases. So those are three separate epidemiologic scenarios in which this population prioritization is then described. For each of those, there are three stages of prioritization described according to the availability of vaccine. The first stage being enough doses to account for 10% of the population, the second stage between 11 and 20% of the population, and the third stage beyond 20%. In stage one, for some of the scenarios, it's divided into a stage 1A and B, under the assumption that at the very earliest phase of vaccine rollout, countries will not be able to procure or to receive immediately the full doses to account for 10% of the population. So SAGE tried to give a further steer on what would be the highest priority for the very first set of doses that arrive, and then what would be the next priority within that stage one of phasing. The two highest priorities are to immunize both healthcare workers who have high or very high risk of infection with COVID. And the second group is those adults who are older adults. So we'll use the word elderly here, to be defined by each country of what the age categorization would be for those that are at highest risk of serious illness and death. And the document goes on then to describe in phase 2 and phase 3 additional groups that would be prioritized. SAGE would recommend for prioritization of vaccine, allowing for countries to adapt within those stages something specific for what's actually happening within the countries. Do you want to add to that, Alejandro?
I think that was perfect. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brian, for this answer. So now we will go to Nina Larsson from AFP, also Geneva-based correspondent. Nina?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for taking my question. I was just wondering if you had any specific concerns about the safety procedures being used by some of the most advanced COVID vaccines so far, and if that, in what way that might have impacted your recommendations. And also you mentioned the communications around this. Could you give us some details about what these communications should look like and how they might be linked to concerns over vaccine skepticism? Thank you.
Joachim?
I'll take those.
You want to take it?
I can address some of them. So I think SAGE reinforced the importance of both the importance of and the commitment to GCP. I think what was also reinforced by SAGE was recognizing the desire for as much transparency as possible in the conduct of the trials, while at the same time respecting the individual medical privacy of individuals who have volunteered to be in these trials. And I think that both of those concepts were reinforced by SAGE as being extremely important, both to secure the confidence of people around the world in the high standard of the conduct of the trials and their attending to, in a scrupulous way, the good clinical practice guidelines that are out there, while at the same time being sure that there is not a violation of people's privacy who are participating in these trials. So there was, I think, just a reinforcement from SAGE about the importance of this and the expectation that all of the manufacturers and entities that are sponsoring trials and the clinical investigators are respecting all of those rules. With respect to communication and vaccine skepticism, or all of the elements that go with that, there is very important component where these prioritization populations and the principles that underlie them really are of value only if they're well understood and well taken up by both policymakers and by other decision makers in countries. So there is a communication plan for now that the document has been completed, and it is a living document that will be updated as this pandemic continues to evolve. But it's really important as one of the principles that was explicated in the values framework, that those people who are the beneficiaries of policies need to be well involved in the development of the policies and have transparency and clarity on the basis for those policies. And so in that respect, a clear, broad, diverse communication out of these documents is one of the things that we're hoping to achieve by sharing them with you today.
The only thing I would add, Kate, is since due to the way that these vaccines are being developed and will be used, the two things that we feel are extremely necessary. One, we need to follow the safety of these vaccines for a longer time once they start being used, especially in this much more massive way. And for that, the countries need to have in place what we call the pharmacovigilance program that will allow us to follow if any of these vaccines give any adverse effects once they start being given to a much larger part of the population. The other thing that we need is also to make sure that we have a way of assessing how the vaccine is actually having an impact on both the mortality and hopefully other factors related to the disease. And for that, of course, we need what we call phase 4 studies, which in a sense are not the obligation of SAGE, but in a sense, we feel that given the way that these vaccines are going to be implemented, these are things that will need to be put in place and followed very carefully in that sense. I think that those would be the main things.
Thank you very much. So we now go to Linda Lee from South China Morning Post. Linda, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yes, hi, thanks for taking my question. This is Linda from Hong Kong. The question I wanted to ask is about China just announced they are joining COVAX today, which I think is a bit of a good news, but I think that also raises a question on, I just wanted to ask whether that changes maybe some of the work that SAGE experts have been doing, because I think with China joining COVAX, it adds, I guess, this really large population of people needing to receive vaccines to the platform. And also with China being the front runner and having at least several of the vaccine candidates that are in stage 3 clinical trials, I wanted to ask if SAGE experts have been consulted about any of these R&D and anything else that you could comment on those vaccine candidates coming from China. Thank you.
Do you want to address SAGE working group policies?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think the first thing in relation to your comment that China is joining COVAX today, which is of course a great news, is to clarify that the policy that SAGE develops and the guidance that we are putting out are global guidance. So they relate actually to each and every country, irrespective of whether they are within COVAX or not. So I think that is a general thing. And as Kate laid out, the principles need to be considered and adopted in each and every country, and that obviously also applies to China. In relation to the working group, the SAGE working group, that is really the group that works with SAGE and develops all reviews all the evidences, and then really proposes those to the SAGE committee. We are obviously in contact with vaccine manufacturers, and the way we are doing is that we, and this is a joint effort within WHO, we of course solicit data, not only data that is published, but also data that companies can share while they are developing. And we are doing this, we have set clear rules. We're doing this once vaccines have entered phase 3 development. And so we have been in contact with Chinese manufacturers already, and of course, this will continue. So this is an ongoing process for us to be really upfront and up to date in relation to the clinical development of vaccines. Let me just add one point, which I think might be interesting. The working group has put out a document which is on the website of WHO, which is called a compendium of questions, which relates to a number of questions that are important for the development of policy that relate, of course, to a large extent to questions in relation to the performance of vaccine, its effectiveness, its safety, but also a number of other issues. And when you look at this document, we realize that some of this information may actually come only later down the road, but it gives a clear indication and provides transparency in terms of what are the data that we would like to see in order to be really able to formulate robust policy as vaccines get authorized for use. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hombach, for this. Our next question comes from Helen Branswell from STAT. Helen, can you hear us, Helen? Good morning to you.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I was hoping somebody could explain to me the thinking behind the second dose of IPV in the polio program. The problem with VDPV is caused because there isn't enough vaccine use, there isn't enough coverage. And if you can't get coverage with oral vaccine, why do you think you're going to get more coverage with a second dose of a more expensive and harder to administer injectable vaccine?
You were broken a little bit, Helen, but I'll call on Simona to see if she got your question. Or Simona, did you understand the question? Did you hear it completely, or we will ask Helen to repeat?
It was also a bit broken up for me, but I think I got the question. So I'll try to answer. And if I don't get it right or there's something else, I'm happy to take a follow-up. So Helen, that's a very important question, and I think an important point for us to clarify. So indeed, adding the second dose of IPV is not by itself going to stop the CVD-PV2s. Adding the second dose of IPV, though, is going to boost children's protection against poliovirus and reduce the risk of VAP. So vaccine-associated paralytic polio, so children themselves suffering from paralysis. So as you'll recall, several years ago, we had a situation in Israel where we detected poliovirus circulating in the sewage, but we didn't have any children who were paralyzed. And that's because that's a country that had a very high level of coverage with multiple doses of IPV. And so that's really what we're aiming for with the second dose here, is providing that protection to individuals. This dose will be given as part of the routine immunization program. And I think as Dr. Alejandro mentioned, SAGE was very clear that that's where the value is. It's in adding this second dose of IPV to the routine schedule and not doing campaigns with it. So I think we're hopeful that that will provide that protection on the individual level. But on the topic of improving quality and reach, that's certainly a key point for polio. And I think no matter what new tool or new vaccine we have, if we're not able to deliver high quality campaigns that reach people, we're not going to be able to stop these CVD-PV2 outbreaks. And that's something that the program is prioritizing going forward and really has to be improved on for us to be able to stop these. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. I'll go back to Helen. Helen, did this answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you, Simona. Thank you, Helen. Next question comes from Bianca Rotier from Globo, from Brazil. Bianca.
Hi, Tariq. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for taking my question. My question is about the age. When Brazil announced the details of participation to the COVAX facility, it was 2 days ago, the government said that only elderly people with 80 years old or over would benefit. What are the recommendations about age? I heard that each country needs to decide, but who would be considered at risk?
So then maybe I'll take that question. As I think everybody is watching the epidemiologic data come out on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, we do see that there is variability across different countries with respect to the risk of severe disease and the risk of death according to age. What is consistent across all countries is that the older you are, the higher your risk is. Each country has a different age pyramid and different, of course, proportion of the population that is in different age strata. So it's difficult to give a recommendation that is a global recommendation about a specific age cutoff for who would be of highest priority for the age-based criteria. What is consistently seen in the modeling is that there is benefit, highest priority benefit, the older that you get. The determination of what that age cutoff should be, whether it's 50 years old in some countries, 60 years old, 65, 70, 80 years old, is really a decision that needs to be made at the level of the country based on data that is being seen in the pandemic within the country. So those policy decisions for Brazil about, in first priority, targeting those over 80 years of age is really a domestic decision, presumably based on data within the country.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brian. We have one follow-up question from Gunilla. Gunilla, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry to insist on this, but I just really would like to understand, could a vaccine, COVID vaccine, be approved for use before a phase 3 is finalized and all results are published? Thanks.
You've asked a couple of questions embedded in that one sentence, so maybe I can tick them off. Publication is one issue, and there is, to my knowledge, not a requirement for publication of evidence before a product could be authorized. You asked whether or not a phase 3 clinical trial would have to be completed, and I think it depends what we mean by completed. There are what has been described in the documents around that the regulators have provided about consideration of data from phase 3 clinical trials is that there has to be outcome data from phase 3 clinical trials, and the FDA guidance in particular has been very specific about what exactly would be required of the data that would be provided, a minimum of a 2-month mean safety follow-up, and specifications around what the point estimate of efficacy, the minimum point efficacy and the lower bound on that efficacy would be, even for an early use listing. So I think the idea of completing a clinical trial has more specificity around it, because if the trials, because of the underlying efficacy of a vaccine, accrue enough cases before the intended finalization that was specified in the clinical trial protocol, almost every clinical trial, COVID or not, for vaccines allows for an early look at the data once specified, an a priori pre-specified measure has been reached. So I just don't want to parse words here, but you did use the word completing the clinical trial, and the early use listing regulatory documents do require that the ongoing conduct of the trial to accrue as much additional information as possible, even if efficacy has been demonstrated in an earlier look than what is envisioned by the entirety of the trial. I think the important point here is, and so I think we've gotten into sort of a little bit of technical details around the conduct of clinical trials. The concept that I think is most important is that both WHO and the stringent regulatory authorities are requiring results from clinical phase 3 trials that are conclusive results, and will not be considering products until they have such demonstrated efficacy. And metrics have been put out there of what is the minimum measure of efficacy and the minimum safety follow-up. And I think it's clear that there will be scrupulous attention to those.
Thank you very much. We are coming slowly to an end of this press briefing. I will just read one last question that we received from Libby George, who is with Reuters in Lagos. And he says, I would like to know how concerned SAGE is regarding outbreaks of vaccine preventable diseases due to COVID-related vaccination disruptions, and how quickly these could crop up following delayed or canceled campaigns.
I think that's the best question that we could receive, because that's been our main worry. If you look at what has happened in some parts of the world where we have had outbreaks of diseases such as Ebola, there have been more children dying of measles in the Democratic Republic of Congo than dying of Ebola. And we haven't really made this big distinction about how our immunization services are really compromised when we have another problem in hand. And with the COVID situation, and that's why we made it clear that within the immunization framework that we're dealing for the next 10 years, we have not needed to put in the COVID factor as something that is essential, because we don't want the resources, including the financial and the human ones, to be taken over by COVID instead of being used to vaccinate children against diphtheria, tetanus, measles, polio, etc. So on one side, the vaccination services have to be an integral part of our primary care systems that will keep them up, that under a safe situation will allow us to re-establish them, to look for the children who haven't been vaccinated and have a catch-up program to make sure that they are immunized, regardless of the efforts being done within the COVID-19 part. I think what is important is to make sure that we see all of these as a single entity, as a single problem that we have. And since, as Kate was saying, we might be vaccinating the elderly against COVID, then we have to make sure that we're vaccinating the younger ones against all the other diseases for which we have a vaccine. But this has to be seen as an integrated approach in that sense. Otherwise, we're going to have massive problems once this whole thing gets resolved or not within the next years. That is why we have now a whole framework and a roadmap for countries to look into how many children they haven't vaccinated, how many children they need to catch up, and what are the vaccines that need to be available. And on the side of the Gavi-supported countries, they have now a plan to put actual money into how they detect those children that haven't been vaccinated and make sure that they are immunized. So I think that we are aware of the problem. This is a very important part. We have to make sure that we catch up, that we start vaccinating the newer ones up, and that it doesn't get more disrupted than necessary within the other needs of vaccinating another group of population against the pandemic virus.
Let me just add one thing to what Dr. Cravioto said, is immunization is a component of essential health services, and the word essential is just that. They are essential because they are life-saving vaccines. And with the backsliding of the immunization program and over 80 campaigns that have been stood down in over 50 countries, these are hundreds of millions of vaccine doses that are not being given right now, leaving largely children, but also adolescents, unprotected against deadly illnesses for which we already have vaccines. So as the world's attention is appropriately put on COVID-19 vaccine development and readiness for deployment, at the same time, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and stand back up the immunization program, which is the bedrock for primary healthcare services in so many countries, and will be the bedrock for the delivery of COVID vaccines. It is the supply chain, the cold chain. It is the healthcare workers. It is the safety surveillance system. And unless and until we get those stood back up again with the strength that they had prior to COVID-19 pandemic, we're not going to be in the position of being able to deliver COVID vaccines with the depth and breadth and speed that is needed. And we will certainly be facing other outbreaks, deadly outbreaks in the coming years that will be the aftermath and the ripple effect that will kill thousands and millions of children. So we can't put, there's no way of being more emphatic about the importance of reestablishing the immunization programs, the confidence of communities, parents, families, and the confidence of healthcare workers that they can be providing essential life-saving interventions that vaccines are with safety and confidence.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bryan. With this important message, we will conclude today's press briefing. I will just remind journalists that there is no embargo on this briefing, that the audio file will be sent to you in coming hour or so, that the summary of the meeting will be posted early next week, and that the full report will be published beginning of December. For journalists who have not been here from the beginning, as Dr. Hombach explained. Once again, big thanks to Simona Zipursky, who was online with us, Dr. Bryan, Dr. Hombach, and Dr. Craviotto, who were here. And I wish everyone a lovely day and a nice weekend.